Steve Jobs 1972 to 1985. Pre-Apple. In mid-1973, Jobs moved back to the San Francisco Bay Area and was renting his own apartment. Brennan states by this point that their relationship was complicated. "I couldn't break the connection and I couldn't commit. Steve couldn't either." Jobs hitchhiked and worked around the West Coast and Brennan would occasionally join him. At the same time, Brennan notes, "Little by little, Steve and I separated. But we were never able to fully let go. We never talked about breaking up or going our separate ways, and we didn't have that conversation where one person says it's over." They continued to grow apart, but Jobs would still seek her out and visit her while she was working in a health food store or as a live-in babysitter. They remained involved with each other while continuing to see other people. In 1973, Steve Wozniak designed his own version of the classic video game Pong. After finishing it, Wozniak gave the board to Jobs, who then took the game down to Atari Incorporated in Los Gatos, California. Atari thought that Jobs had built it and gave him a job as a technician. Atari's co-founder Nolan Bushnell later described him as difficult but valuable, pointing out that he was very often the smartest guy in the room, and he would let people know that. By early 1974, Jobs was living what Brennan describes as a simple life in a Los Gatos cabin, working at Atari, and saving money for his impending trip to India. Brennan visited him twice at the cabin. She states in her memoir that her memories of this cabin consist of Jobs reading Be Here Now, and giving her a copy, listening to South Indian music, and using a Japanese meditation pillow. Brennan felt that he was more distant and negative toward her. Brennan states in her memoir that she met with Jobs right before he left for India and that he tried to give her a $100 bill that he had earned at Atari. She initially refused to accept it but eventually accepted the money. Jobs traveled to India in mid-1974 to visit Neem Karoli Baba at his Kainchi ashram with his Reed friend, and eventual Apple employee, Daniel Kutke, in search of spiritual enlightenment. When they got to the Neem Karoli ashram, it was almost deserted because Neem Karoli Baba had died in September 1973. Then they made a long trek up a dry riverbed to an ashram of Haidakant Babaji. In India, they spent a lot of time on bus rides from Delhi to Uttar Pradesh and Himachal Pradesh. After staying for 7 months, Jobs left India and returned to the US ahead of Daniel Kutke. Jobs had changed his appearance. His head was shaved and he wore traditional Indian clothing. During this time, Jobs experimented with psychedelics, later calling his LSD experiences one of the 2 or 3 most important things he had done in his life. He spent a period at the All One Farm, a commune in Oregon that was owned by Robert Friedland. Brennan joined him there for a period. During this time period, Jobs and Brennan both became practitioners of Zen Buddhism through the Zen master Kobun Chino Otagawa. Jobs was living with his parents again, in their backyard tool shed which he had converted into a bedroom with a sleeping bag, mat, books, a candle, and a meditation pillow. Jobs engaged in lengthy meditation retreats at the Tassajara Zen Mountain Center, the oldest Soto Zen monastery in the U.S. He considered taking up monastic residence at Eiheiji in Japan, and maintained a lifelong appreciation for Zen. Jobs would later say that people around him who did not share his countercultural roots could not fully relate to his thinking. Jobs then returned to Atari and was assigned to create a circuit board for the arcade video game Breakout. According to Bushnell, Atari offered $100 for each TTL chip that was eliminated in the machine. Jobs had little specialized knowledge of circuit board design and made a deal with Wozniak to split the fee evenly between them if Wozniak could minimize the number of chips. Much to the amazement of Atari engineers, Wozniak reduced the TTL count to 46, a design so tight that it was impossible to reproduce on an assembly line. According to Wozniak, Jobs told him that Atari gave them only $700, instead of the $5,000 paid out, and that Wozniak's share was thus $350. Wozniak did not learn about the actual bonus until 10 years later, but said that if Jobs had told him about it and explained that he needed the money, Wozniak would have given it to him. 104107 Wozniak had designed a low-cost digital blue box to generate the necessary tones to manipulate the telephone network, allowing free long-distance calls. Jobs decided that they could make money selling it. The clandestine sales of the illegal blue boxes went well and perhaps planted the seed in Jobs' mind that electronics could be both fun and profitable. Jobs, in a 1994 interview, recalled that it took 6 months for him and Wozniak to figure out how to build the blue boxes. Jobs said that if not for the blue boxes, there would have been no Apple. He states it showed them that they could take on large companies and beat them. Jobs and Wozniak attended meetings of the Homebrew Computer Club in 1975, which was a stepping stone to the development and marketing of the first Apple computer. Apple, 1976 to 1985. In 1976, Wozniak designed and developed the Apple I computer and showed it to Jobs, who suggested that they sell it. Jobs, Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne founded Apple Computer, now called Apple Incorporated, in the garage of Jobs' Los Altos home on Crist Drive. Wayne stayed only a short time, leaving Jobs and Wozniak as the active primary co-founders of the company. The two decided on the name Apple after Jobs returned from the All-One Farm commune in Oregon and told Wozniak about his time spent in the farm's apple orchard. A neighbor on Crist Drive recalled Jobs as an odd individual who would greet his clients with his underwear hanging out, barefoot and hippie-like. Another neighbor, Larry Waterland, who had just earned his Ph.D. in chemical engineering at Stanford, recalled dismissing Jobs' budding business. "You punched cards, put them in a big deck," he said about the mainframe machines of that time. "Steve took me over to the garage. He had a circuit board with a chip on it, a Dumont TV set, a Panasonic cassette tape deck and a keyboard. He said, 'This is an Apple computer.' I said, 'You've got to be joking.' I dismissed the whole idea." Jobs' friend from Reed College in India, Daniel Kotke, recalled that as an early Apple employee, he was the only person who worked in the garage. Woz would show up once a week with his latest code. Steve Jobs didn't get his hands dirty in that sense. Kotke also stated that much of the early work took place in Jobs' kitchen, where he spent hours on the phone trying to find investors for the company. They received funding from a then semi-retired Intel product marketing manager and engineer Mike Markkula. Scott McNealy, one of the co-founders of Sun Microsystems, said that Jobs broke a glass-age ceiling in Silicon Valley because he created a very successful company at a young age. Markkula brought Apple to the attention of Arthur Rock, which after looking at the crowded Apple booth at the Homebrew Computer Show, started with a $60,000 investment and went on the Apple board. After she returned from her own journey to India, Brennan visited Jobs at his parents' home, where he was still living. It was during this period that Jobs and Brennan fell in love again, as Brennan noted changes in him that she attributes to Coboon, whom she was also still following. It was also at this time that Jobs displayed a prototype Apple computer for Brennan and his parents in their living room. Brennan notes a shift in this time period, where the two main influences on Jobs were Apple and Coboon. By the early 1977, she and Jobs would spend time together at her home at Duvnek Ranch in Los Altos, which served as a hostel and environmental education center. Brennan also worked there as a teacher for inner-city children who came to learn about the farm. In 1977, Jobs and Wozniak introduced the Apple II at the West Coast Computer Fair. It was the first consumer product sold by Apple Computer and was one of the first highly successful mass-produced microcomputer products in the world, designed primarily by Steve Wozniak. Jobs oversaw the development of the Apple II's unusual case and Rod Holt developed the unique power supply. Jobs usually went to work wearing a black long-sleeved mock turtleneck made by Issey Miyake. It was sometimes reported as Street Qua brand, Levi's 501 blue jeans, and New Balance 991 sneakers. He said his choice was inspired by that of Stuart Schman, a noted applied mathematics professor at Brown University. Jobs told his biographer Walter Isaacson, he came to like the idea of having a uniform for himself, both because of its daily convenience, the rationale he claimed, and its ability to convey a signature style. As Jobs became more successful with his new company, his relationship with Brennan grew more complex. In 1977, the success of Apple was now a part of their relationship, and Brennan, Daniel Kotke, and Jobs moved into a house near the Apple office in Cupertino. Brennan eventually took a position in the shipping department at Apple. Brennan's relationship with Jobs was deteriorating as his position with Apple grew, and she began to consider ending the relationship through small changes. In October 1977, Brennan was approached by Rod Holt, who asked her to take a paid apprenticeship designing blueprints for the Apples. Both Holt and Jobs felt that it would be a good position for her, given her artistic abilities. Holt was particularly eager that she take the position and puzzled by her ambivalence toward it. Brennan's decision, however, was overshadowed by the fact that she realized she was pregnant and that Jobs was the father. It took her a few days to tell Jobs, whose face, according to Brennan, turned ugly at the news. At the same time, according to Brennan, at the beginning of her third trimester, Jobs said to her, "I never wanted to ask that you get an abortion. I just didn't want to do that." He also refused to discuss the pregnancy with her. Brennan herself felt confused about what to do. She was estranged from her mother and afraid to discuss the matter with her father. She also did not feel comfortable with the idea of having an abortion. She chose instead to discuss the matter with Coburn, who encouraged her to have and keep the baby, and pledged his support. Meanwhile, Holt was waiting for her decision on the internship. Brennan stated that Jobs continued to encourage her to take the internship, stating she could be pregnant and work at Apple. "You can take the job. I don't get what the problem is." Brennan, however, notes that she felt so ashamed, "The thought of my growing belly in the professional environment at Apple, with the child being his, while he was unpredictable, in turn being punishing and sentimentally ridiculous. I could not have endured it." Brennan turned down the internship and decided to leave Apple. She stated that Jobs told her, "If you give up this baby for adoption, you will be sorry and I am never going to help you." Now alone, Brennan was on welfare and cleaning houses to earn money. She would sometimes ask Jobs for money, but he always refused. Brennan hid her pregnancy for as long as she could, living in a variety of homes and continuing her work with Zen meditation. At the same time, according to Brennan, Jobs started to seed people with the notion that I slept around and he was infertile, which meant that this could not be his child. A few weeks before she was due to give birth, Brennan was invited to deliver her baby at the All One farm and she accepted the offer. When Jobs was 23, the same age as his biological parents when they had him, Brennan gave birth to her baby, Lisa Brennan, on May 17, 1978. Jobs went there for the birth after he was contacted by Robert Friedland, their mutual friend and the farm owner. While distant, Jobs worked with her on a name for the baby, which they discussed while sitting in the fields on a blanket. Brennan suggested the name Lisa, which Jobs also liked, and notes that Jobs was very attached to the name Lisa while he was also publicly denying paternity. She would discover later that during this time, Jobs was preparing to unveil a new kind of computer that he wanted to give a female name. His first choice was Claire, after Street Claire. She also stated that she never gave him permission to use the baby's name for a computer and he hid the plans from her. Jobs also worked with his team to come up with the phrase, "local integrated software architecture," as an alternative explanation for the Apple Lisa. Decades later, however, Jobs admitted to his biographer Walter Isaacson that obviously, "it was named for my daughter." Brennan would come under intense criticism from Jobs, who claimed that "she doesn't want money, she just wants me." According to Brennan, Apple's Mike Scott wanted Jobs to give her money, while other Apple executives advised him to ignore me or fight if I tried to go after a paternity settlement. When Jobs denied paternity, a DNA test established him as Lisa's father. It required him to give Brennan $385 a month in addition to returning the welfare money she had received. Jobs gave her $500 a month at the time when Apple went public, and Jobs became a millionaire. Brennan worked as a waitress in Palo Alto. Later, Brennan agreed to give an interview with Michael Moritz for Time magazine for its Time Person of the Year special, released on January 3, 1983, in which he discussed her relationship with Jobs. Rather than name Jobs the Person of the Year, the magazine named the computer the Machine of the Year. In the issue, Jobs questioned the reliability of the paternity test, which stated that the probability of paternity for Jobs, Stephen, is 94.1%. Jobs responded by arguing that 28% of the male population of the United States could be the father. Time also noted that the baby girl in the machine on which Apple has placed so much hope for the future share the same name, Lisa. Jobs was worth over $1 million in 1978 when he was just 23 years old. This grew to over $250 million by the time he was 25, according to estimates. He was also one of the youngest people ever to make the Forbes list of the nation's richest people, and one of only a handful to have done it themselves, without inherited wealth. In 1978, Apple recruited Mike Scott from National Semiconductor to serve as CEO for what turned out to be several turbulent years. In 1983, Jobs lured John Sculley away from Pepsi Cola to serve as Apple's CEO, asking, "Do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugared water, or do you want a chance to change the world?" 386 to 387 inches 1982, Jobs bought an apartment in the two top floors of the San Remo, a Manhattan building with a politically progressive reputation. Although he never lived there, he spent years renovating it with the help of I.M. Pei. In 2003, he sold it to U2 singer Bono. In 1984, Jobs bought the Jacqueline House and estate, and resided there for a decade. After that, he leased it out for several years until 2000 when he stopped maintaining the house, allowing exposure to the weather to degrade it. In 2004, Jobs received permission from the town of Woodside to demolish the house in order to build a smaller contemporary-styled one. After a few years in court, the house was finally demolished in 2011, a few months before he died. In early 1984, Apple introduced the Macintosh, which was based on the Lisa and Xerox PARC's mouse-driven graphical user interface, and conceived by early Apple employee Jeff Raskin. The following year, Apple aired a Super Bowl television commercial titled 1984. At Apple's annual shareholders meeting on January 24, 1984, an emotional Jobs introduced the Macintosh to a wildly enthusiastic audience, Andy Hertzfeld described the scene as pandemonium. Despite the fanfare, the expensive Macintosh was a hard sell. Shortly after its release in 1985, Bill Gates's then-developing company, Microsoft, threatened to stop developing Mac applications unless it was granted a license for the Mac operating system software. Microsoft was developing its graphical user interface, for DOS, which it was calling Windows, and didn't want Apple to sue over the similarities between the Windows GUI and the Mac interface. Sculley granted Microsoft the license, which later led to problems for Apple. In addition, cheap IBM PC clones that ran on Microsoft software and had a graphical user interface began to appear. Although the Macintosh preceded the clones, it was far more expensive, so through the late 1980s, the Windows user interface was getting better and better and was thus taking increasingly more share from Apple. Windows-based IBM PC clones also led to the development of additional GUIs such as IBM's TopView or Digital Research's GEM, and thus the graphical user interface was beginning to be taken for granted, undermining the most apparent advantage of the Mac. It seemed clear as the 1980s wound down that Apple couldn't go it alone indefinitely against the whole IBM clone market. Sculley's and Jobs' respective visions for the company greatly differed. The former favored open architecture computers like the Apple II, sold to education, small business, and home markets less vulnerable to IBM. Jobs wanted the company to focus on the closed architecture Macintosh as a business alternative to the IBM PC. President and CEO Sculley had little control over Chairman of the Board Jobs' Macintosh division. It and the Apple II division operated like separate companies, duplicating services. Although its products provided 85% of Apple's sales in early 1985, the company's January 1985 annual meeting did not mention the Apple II division or employees. Many left, including Wozniak, who stated that the company had been going in the wrong direction for the last 5 years and sold most of his stock. The Macintosh's failure to defeat the PC strengthened Sculley's position in the company. In May 1985, Sculley, encouraged by Arthur Rock, decided to reorganize Apple, and proposed a plan to the board that would remove Jobs from the Macintosh group and put him in charge of new product development. This move would effectively render Jobs powerless within Apple. In response, Jobs then developed a plan to get rid of Sculley and take over Apple. However, Jobs was confronted after the plan was leaked, and he said that he would leave Apple. The board declined his resignation and asked him to reconsider. Sculley also told Jobs that he had all of the votes needed to go ahead with the reorganization. A few months later, on September 17, 1985, Jobs submitted a letter of resignation to the Apple board. 5 additional senior Apple employees also resigned and joined Jobs in his new venture, Next.